We're going to move on to this session on globalization and regionalization, or from globalization to regionalization. As you can see, I'm joined by the Foreign Minister of Greece, Georgios Gerapetritis, by Wess Mitchell, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State in America, and David Harris. David, I hope you can hear us. Can you hear me? Excellent. David Harris, Senior Strategic Advisor at the Henry Jackson Society in London, and very relevant to our purposes today, former Chief Executive Officer of the American Jewish Committee. All very welcome. We're going to hear first from the Minister, and we'll take it in turns, and then we'll have a few things to talk about, I think. Minister, very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Ευχαριστώ πολύ για την ιδιαίτερη τιμή της πρόσκλησης σήμερα στο συνέδριο του Economist. Είναι ένα μοναδικό φόρουμ για να υπάρχει μια ανταλλαγή απόψεων υψηλού επίπεδου, έτσι ώστε να αναδείξουμε τα κοινά προβλήματα τα οποία μας ταλανίζουν και να δούμε τις λύσεις και τις διεξόδους οι οποίες είναι αναγκαίες στην ζωή μας για την ευημερία του σήμερα, αλλά και την ευημερία των επόμενων γενεών. Θερμές ευχαριστίες στην Νεκταρία και τον Ντάνιελ και σε όλο το προσωπικό του Economist. Είναι επίσης πολύ μεγάλη χαρά να συνομιλήσω σήμερα με δύο φίλους της Ελλάδας, με δύο εξαιρετικά διακεκριμένες προσωπικότητες, με τον Wess Mitchell και τον Daniel Harris, οι οποίοι έχουν αναδειχθεί μέσα από μια μακρά διαδρομή στην πολιτική και στην οικονομία. Σήμερα θα έπρεπε να συζητήσουμε κυρίως για τα θέματα που αφορούν την αλληλεπίδραση μεταξύ του παγκόσμιου, του περιφερειακού και του εθνικού και πώς η αλληλεπίδραση αυτή διαμορφώνει ένα σύγχρονο κόσμο, διαμορφώνει μια νέα μέθοδο λήψης αποφάσεων και πώς στο τέλος της ημέρας η σύγχρονη πολυεπίπεδη διακυβέρνηση είναι σε θέση να ανταποκριθεί επιτυχώς στις προκλήσεις οι οποίες μας κατακλείζουν. Εν τούτης, υπό τις συνθήκες που διαμορφώνονται, θα περιοριστώ σε λίγα λόγια μόνο για το θέμα αυτό του περιφερειακού και του οικουμενικού και στη συνέχεια θα επικεντρωθώ στα πιο επίκαιρα και πιο σημαντικά της εξωτερικής μας πολιτικής και ιδίως στην κρίση της Μέσης Ανατολής, η οποία αυτή τη στιγμή βρίσκεται στο επίκεντρο του ενδιαφέροντος. Να πω το εξής, ότι υπό τις συνθήκες η έννοια των θεμάτων εθνικού, περιφερειακού και οικουμενικού ενδιαφέροντος έχει αμβληνθεί απολύτως. Δεν υπάρχει κανένα θέμα το οποίο να λογίζεται ως αμιγώς εθνικό ή ως αμιγώς περιφερειακό ή ακόμη και οικουμενικό. Είναι τέτοια η διάδραση όλων αυτών των επιπέδων που κάθε κρίση στην πραγματικότητα αντανακλά σε ένα επίπεδο εθνικό, σε ένα επίπεδο ευρύτερο ή σε ένα επίπεδο παγκόσμιο. Νομίζω ότι οι μεγάλες προκλήσεις του σήμερα είναι αυτές οι οποίες διαμορφώνουν και το πλαίσιο. Είναι η κλιματική κρίση, την οποία όλοι βιώσαμε με τον πιο επώδυνο τρόπο, είναι η επισιτιστική κρίση, είναι η επιθετικότητα, είναι η δημόσια υγεία και είναι και η μετανάστευση. Οι 5 σύγχρονες προκλήσεις, οι οποίες όλες έχουν 3 κοινά χαρακτηριστικά. Το πρώτο είναι ότι στην πραγματικότητα δεν έχουν τόπο και χρόνο. Είναι υπερτοπικές και είναι διαχρονικές. Οι αντανακλαστικές συνέπειες από τις 5 μεγάλες αυτές προκλήσεις ουσιαστικά αγγίζουν όλους μας, όπου και αν βρισκόμαστε, σε όποιον χρόνο και αν ζούμε. Επίσης, δεύτερο χαρακτηριστικό κοινό είναι η κατάρριψη των βεβαιοτήτων που είχαμε. Βιώνουμε όλοι πολέμους στη γειτονιά μας που θεωρούσαμε σχεδόν αυτονόητο ότι μετά από δεκαετίες μιας σχετικής ηρεμίας, ιδίως στην Ευρώπη, είχαμε ξεχάσει. Η εισβολή της Ρωσίας στην Ουκρανία νομίζω ανέδειξε με το πιο ισχυρό τρόπο ότι ο αναθεωρητισμός είναι στην πόρτα μας και δεν πρέπει να εκλαμβάνουμε τίποτε ως ασφαλές και βέβαιο. Και βεβαίως, εκείνο το οποίο έχει επίσης ένα κοινό έδαφος είναι ότι οι οικουμενικές κρίσεις οι οποίες εμφανίζονται δεν αντιμετωπίζονται πάντοτε με οικουμενικές λύσεις. Συγκρατώ από την τελευταία Γενική Συνέλευση του Οργανισμού Ηνωμένων Εθνών στη Νέα Υόρκη μία αποστροφή του Γενικού Γραμματέα του Οργανισμού Ηνωμένων Εθνών, ο οποίος είπε ότι ο συμβιβασμός έχει καταντήσει να είναι μία βρώμικη λέξη. Έχουμε μία δυσκολία στο να μπορέσουμε να καθίσουμε και να συζητήσουμε για προβλήματα τα οποία είναι κοινά, μας αγγίζουν όλους, αγγίζουν το σήμερα και το αύριο. Παρά τα αυτά, δυσκολευόμαστε πολύ να έχουμε μία διαβουλευτική στάση απέναντι στα πράγματα, έτσι ώστε να βρίσκουμε λύσεις οι οποίες θα είναι ωφέλιμες. Οφείλουμε να είμαστε διαβουλευτικοί, να αντιμετωπίζουμε τα θέματα με περίσκεψη και κυρίως να βάλουμε μέσα στη σκέψη μας και το μέλλον και όχι μόνο το παρόν, το σήμερα ή το χθες. Δείτε λίγο μόνο τις τελευταίες ημέρες από την άποψη των εξωτερικών σχέσεων της Ελλάδας. Χθες είχαμε στο Λουξεμβούργο το Συμβούλιο Εξωτερικών Υποθέσεων της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Τα θέματα τα οποία ήταν στην ατζέντα ήταν σε πραγματικότητα θέματα τα οποία δεν μπορείς να τα περιορίσεις στην περιφέρεια στην οποία αναπτύσσονται. Ήταν ο πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία, ήταν η κρίση στην περιοχή του Σαχέλ στην Αφρική, κυρίως στην υποσαχάρια Αφρική, η κρίση στα Βαλκάνια, ιδίως η κρίση η οποία αναπτύσσεται στο Κόσοβο, η κρίση την οποία έχουμε στα σύνορα Αρμενίας-Αζερμπαϊτζάν και βεβαίως η Μέση Ανατολή. Κρίσεις οι οποίες όλες έχουν μία έδρα, αλλά έχουν μία τεράστια αντανάκλαση. Η Μέση Ανατολή. Η Μέση Ανατολή είναι μία μεγάλη δοκιμή, μία μεγάλη δοκιμασία για όλους μας. Και είναι μία μεγάλη δοκιμασία για όλους μας, διότι πρόκειται για ένα θέμα το οποίο βρίσκεται στην αιχμή της εξωτερικής πολιτικής όλων των χωρών του δυτικού και του αραβικού κόσμου. Η Ελλάδα από την πρώτη στιγμή έλαβε μία θέση αρχής στο ζήτημα αυτό. Όταν ανέκυψε το ζήτημα μετά από την τρομοκρατική επίθεση της Χαμάς στο κράτος του Ισραήλ, η Ελλάδα έλαβε σαφή θέση. Είπαμε, πρώτα απ' όλα καταδικάζουμε και οφείλει όλος ο πολιτισμένος κόσμος να καταδικάσει κάθε μορφή τρομοκρατίας, βίας και απάνθρωπης μεταχείρισης. Είπαμε ότι δεν είναι δυνατόν να υπάρχει η οποιαδήποτε ομηρία, άρα ουσιαστικά να υπάρχει απαξίωση της ανθρώπινης προσωπικότητας στο μέτρο που χρησιμοποιείται ο άνθρωπος ως μέσο εκβίασης μεταξύ των κρατών. Είπαμε ότι δεν είναι δυνατόν να στοχοποιούνται άμαχοι. Είπαμε ότι δεν είναι δυνατόν παρά να εξασφαλίσουμε ανθρωπιστικές διόδους και ανθρωπιστική βοήθεια σε όλους τους ευάλωτους. Και είπαμε τέλος ότι το ζήτημα αυτό θα πρέπει να επιληθεί σε μια διεθνή διάσκεψη υπό την αιγίδα του Οργανισμού Ηνωμένων Εθνών και με την συμμετοχή όλων των ισχυρών παικτών και των ενδιαφερόμενων μερών. Η στάση μας αυτή μας οδήγησε στο να αποκτήσουμε ισχύ, να έχουμε ειλικρίνεια στη στάση μας και να αποκτήσουμε ένα σημαντικό διπλωματικό κεφάλαιο. Η Ελλάδα με τη στεναρή της αυτή στάση σήμερα μπορεί να πενεύεται ότι συνομιλεί με τον αραβικό κόσμο, συνομιλεί με το Ισραήλ και είμαστε αξιόπιστοι σε αυτά τα οποία λέμε. Ναι, εμείς πάντοτε θα είμαστε με την ειρηνική επίλυση των διαφορών. Σήμερα στην επέτειο της ίδρυσης του Οργανισμού Ηνωμένων Εθνών, που ομιλεί ακριβώς για την ειρηνική επίλυση των διαφορών, για το κράτος δικαίου, για τη διασφάλιση των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων. Και ναι, θα πρέπει να διασφαλίσουμε το δικαίωμα των κρατών να αμήνονται σε επιθέσεις στο όριο το οποίο καθιερώνει το διεθνές δίκαιο. Για εμάς θα πρέπει το ζήτημα της Μέσης Ανατολής να υπάρξει στην ατζέντα, στο διεθνές προσκήνιο. Θα πρέπει να δουλέψουμε πάνω στη λύση η οποία έχει ήδη προαχθεί από αποφάσεις, ψηφίσματα του Συμβουλίου Ασφαλείας του Οργανισμού Ηνωμένων Εθνών για τα δύο κράτη, για το κράτος της Παλαιστίνης με πρωτεύουσα την Ανατολική Ιερουσαλήμ. Και ναι, θα πρέπει να διασφαλίζεται ότι το κάθε κράτος δικαιούται στο έδαφος του να απολάβει ηρεμίας, ειρήνης και ακεραιότητας. Η τρομοκρατία σε οποιοδήποτε μορφή της δεν μπορεί να γίνει ανεκτή από κανέναν. Στο πλαίσιο αυτό θα ήθελα να επισημάνω ότι η ελληνική εξωτερική πολιτική θα παραμείνει μια εξωτερική πολιτική αρχών. Δεν πρόκειται να καταστεί ούτε συγκυριακή, ούτε συναλλακτική. Γιατί για εμάς η διπλωματία και η εξωτερική πολιτική είναι πρωτίστως ένα ζήτημα το οποίο αφορά τα συμφέροντα της χώρας μας, είναι όμως και μια ηθική αξίωση να υποστηρίζουμε το δίκαιο, τη δημοκρατία, το διάλογο και την ευημερία. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you, Minister. We'll go straight to Wess Mitchell.
Well, thanks, Daniel, and thanks to the Economist for hosting us here in this beautiful location. It's really terrific to be here, and it's particularly a delight for me to get to see so many good friends in the audience. So it's an extra treat. When Nectaria first asked me a few weeks ago to talk today about the U.S. perspective on the Eastern Mediterranean, I had originally planned to give a somewhat optimistic appraisal. I was going to talk today about how this region has become an unexpected bright spot in an otherwise bleak international picture. I was going to talk about the remarkable diplomatic breakthroughs that we've seen in this region over the last few years, the Abraham Accords, the progress in Greek-Turkish relations, the Israel-Saudi detente. But then came Hamas's attack on Israel. This was a great shock to all of us. Of course, we know that the Middle East is a region that can produce violent surprises, but this was something different. It was an act of animal savagery, premeditated and perpetrated on a grand scale. It was barbaric and evil. It's not yet clear what this event will mean for the geopolitics of the Middle East. Israel has been threatened in a way not seen before, and Israel has every right to respond forcefully to protect its people, and it deserves our full support in that endeavor. The situation in Gaza has serious implications for U.S. strategy in the world. These attacks didn't happen in a vacuum. There are now major conflicts in two of the world's three most important regions. We have a land war in Europe that's in its second year and shows no signs of abating. We have a crisis in the Levant with the potential for dramatic escalation. And on the other side of the world, we have the makings of a military confrontation in the Formosa Strait. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we're in the early phases of what could become the world crisis of our time. Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan are all Western democracies. They sit at the frontier next to large, autocratic, predatory powers. And the stability of all three regions, as has been discussed today, ultimately rests on America having the military capability and political will to deter major aggression. The last two U.S. national defense strategies made it clear that we do not currently possess a military designed to fight wars with two peer competitors simultaneously. So the nub of the strategic problem facing the United States is that we have to respond to the urgent crises in Europe and the Middle East without jeopardizing our ability to deal with the Chinese attack on Taiwan. My view for quite some time now has been that Putin's attack on Ukraine gives us an opportunity to sequence these dangers. The weaker of our two main rivals moved incompetently on a timetable that was faster than China was ready to move against Taiwan. But recent events may make it more tempting for Xi Jinping to make his move. The crisis in Gaza heightens that possibility in my view. This situation is likely to be protracted. Even when Hamas is dealt with, it's just a symptom of a bigger problem in the region, which is Iran. To be clear, I see good reasons, rooted in China's own interests, for it not to choose war. China's economy is struggling. Its army has little experience outside of internal policing. The better bet, from Xi's perspective, would probably be to play the clock. But history is full of wars that started for reasons that didn't seem rational at the time. The undeniable fact is that China is preparing for a conflict in the near future. It has accelerated its military buildup. It's conducting air and naval exercises around Taiwan on an almost 24/7 basis. China just launched its third aircraft carrier. It's sprinting to nuclear breakout and has plans for 1,000 warheads by 2030. A war between the United States and the People's Republic of China would have catastrophic consequences out of all proportion to any other crisis currently underway. It's possible that the world will step back from the brink, but the job of leaders is to plan for the worst and work to avoid it, or make sure that we're prepared if they can't. That has to now be the overwhelming focus for the United States and our allies. The current situation, I think, demands that we re-examine how we've been approaching things and make some hard decisions. In the United States, priority number one has to be to make sure that Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan have the tools and support they need to defend themselves. To do that, we have to act urgently to get our defense industrial base in order. The situation is serious enough that we may need to invoke the Defense Production Act. That would mean converting some civilian industries to military production. It's obvious we will have to increase defense spending. That will mean confronting trade-offs with social programs that have broad public support. This will be difficult in an era of inflation, record deficits, and increased entitlement spending. America will also have to stop being naive about our opponents. The current administration tried a second reset with Russia after it came to office, and Putin responded by attacking Ukraine. We gave concessions and cash to Iran to lure it back into the JCPOA, while Iranian proxies run amok. And for more than a year, we've been chasing after détente with China at a time when our deterrent in the Indo-Pacific is weaker than it has been at any point since World War II. The present situation also has implications for Europe. Joseph Borrell is right when he says that Europeans grew too accustomed to cheap gas from Russia, cheap goods from China, and free security from the United States. The Ukraine war has done a lot to get Europeans more serious about security. It forced Europeans to raise defense spending and wean themselves from Russian gas. But even now, less than a third of NATO members are fulfilling their commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Europe will have to sustain aid to Ukraine for what may be a very long fight. In the event of a major crisis in Asia, America will need Europe to step up and play a more significant role in conventional deterrence. The world situation makes alliances more important than ever. The decisions that we made in this part of the world a few years ago to expand U.S.-Greek ties, normalize the security relationship with Cyprus, and launch the 3+1 format are now bearing fruit. Stability here is essential to U.S. global strategy and to European security. That's why Greece's efforts to reduce tensions with Turkey are so important. Recent events make this kind of effort more difficult, but also more necessary. We're entering a time of hard decisions. What's happening in Ukraine and Israel would have seemed unimaginable even a few years ago. We've now had two very serious wake-up calls. We need to move with urgency to prepare ourselves, our alliances, and our societies for more turbulent times ahead. The Western alliance has a long history of rising to the challenge, but we need to wake up. The future, according to China, Russia, and Iran, is not one that any of us would want for our children, and I think that should animate us to confront hard decisions today so that we're not in a worse situation tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wes. Certainly a very, very different speech to the one you would have made just a few weeks ago. David, you can hear us still, I hope. David Harris.
Can you hear me, Daniel?
Yes, we can, loud and clear. So it's great. Very welcome to have you virtually with us here in Athens, and the floor is yours.
I wish I were there in person, but thank you for this opportunity. And I trust people will understand why I could not be there at this time. It's a privilege to follow both the Foreign Minister and the former Assistant Secretary of State. I wanted to begin, as I have in the past, by referring to history, because history is particularly relevant today, I believe. On May the 9th, 1950, Robert Schuman, the French Foreign Minister, proposed what became known as the Treaty of Paris. And this began the building blocks of a new post-war Europe, which created a dependency, particularly between France and Germany, And to paraphrase Robert Schuman at the time, it was to make war unthinkable and materially impossible. And of course, that went into force by 1952. By 1957, the Treaty of Rome followed the Treaty of Paris, and we have today the European Union, its 27 member states. I mention this first because I believe it's going to require exactly this kind of forward-looking, bold, perhaps out-of-the-box thinking on the part of Western leadership, led by the United States in full shoulder-to-shoulder cooperation with the European Union. And here I want to associate myself with the comments just made by Wess Mitchell. It's that kind of inflection point. And I know the term inflection point is cheapened by its overuse, but there is no question that today we face an inflection point. And it's about the immediate crises, yes, but it's also about the longer term of structural response to what we see. With respect to the Eastern Med, as I've said before, on this occasion at Lagonisi, there's another sort of encouraging story to be told that began in the early 1980s when a strategic partnership among Cyprus, Greece, and Israel seemed an impossibly distant dream. To remind us, Greece, together with Spain, was the very last country in Western Europe to extend full de jure diplomatic relations to Israel. That did not come until more than 40 years after Israel's rebirth in 1948. Cyprus was a champion of the Group of 77, the non-aligned movement. Relations among the three were frosty. Fast forward to today, the partnership could not be stronger. And I wish to applaud the foreign minister, who recently traveled with the Prime Minister, Mitsotakis, to Jerusalem to express solidarity, following the footsteps of the President of Cyprus. This is a very sort of telling example of where we are today and how far we've come over the last 40 years of this improbable journey. Again, it's this kind of forward-looking, bold thinking that's required. I mean, obviously, when it comes to events in Israel, beginning on October the 7th, for me, this is not simply about analyzing the situation. You'll understand, I'm sure that this is very personal. I have extensive family in Israel. My wife has two sisters and their families in Israel. One of our daughters-in-law is Israeli. Her entire family is there. Many have been called up from reserve duty. All are traumatized by what has happened. And yet all are remarkably determined, resolute. A few weeks ago, the biggest issue in Israel was judicial reform, which seemed to divide the country, and prognosticators around the world were wondering whether Israeli democracy would survive. Judicial reform is in the rearview mirror. Israel has come together in an instant, all Israelis. It's a remarkable turn of events. The challenges are immense, but I believe that Israeli resolve will take it forward. The questions longer term are profound, I believe, for those assembled at Lagonisi, Daniel, and those watching from around the world. Number one, as I said, will the United States summon the international leadership, which will absolutely be required if we are to face the threats outlined by the previous speakers in a sustained manner and not bounce back and forth from administration to administration? Number two, will Europe summon the strength and resolve to face the need for hard power and not rely excessively on soft power, and partner with the United States over the longer term along the pathway of Robert Schuman and other Harry Truman and other visionaries of what the international liberal order ought to look like, including centrally NATO? Number three, will Israel and the European Union become still closer? The European Union has often created political minefields in its relationship with Israel. Will this make the situation even clearer? And I would add the mutual dependency between Israel and the European Union. The Prime Minister of Israel repeats frequently that the war Israel is facing against jihadism is not a localized war. It is a war that if Israel does not win, will face Europe increasingly. I think he's absolutely right. Number 4, Iran. Wess Mitchell spoke about it. Let me return to it for a moment. Are there still some, particularly in Washington, London, Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, who are still under illusions about the credibility of Iran as a potential partner for an existentially important nuclear deal? Or have those illusions finally been shattered? What we're witnessing today since October the 7th could not have happened on its broad scale without the central involvement and direction of Iran, which raises the question, will Europe finally list the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist group, or will it continue to balk on the question? Similarly with Hezbollah, 11 years ago, 10 years ago, Europe became half pregnant. It listed the so-called political wing of Hezbollah, but not the military wing, as if there were a distinction, as a terrorist group. When will this charade come to an end? How about Qatar? Qatar is a country with very deep pockets, as we all know. They were certainly felt in Brussels not long ago. Qatar has skillfully played both sides of just about every issue, but they are the principal paymasters here of the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is an exponent. Will Qatar continue to be allowed to sit on the fence playing all sides, or will Qatar finally be exposed, and will it be demanded of Qatar that it choose sides and the right side? We don't yet know the full role of Turkey with respect to Hamas, though we know that in the past it has harbored Hamas, and President Erdogan has spoken approvingly of Hamas activities. This too needs to be addressed. I believe, finally, Daniel, that the Israel-Saudi discussions, which may seem to be on hold, must be pressed forward. There must be a vision of redefining the Middle East and making clear who is on which side. And this means security, first and foremost, of course, the security interests not just of the Middle East and friendly countries like Israel, but of Europe and the United States. It also means that we begin to return to the coal and steel vision of Robert Schuman over the long term. We can't do it in the midst of war, but over the long term, and I've said it before here at Lagunisi, that we must return to the inspiration of Robert Schuman. Rather than coal and steel, let it be energy and the environment. Let it be security. But let's begin to build the interdependent relationship among like-minded countries in the Middle East who share the fear of Iran and its long tentacles, who subscribe to a form of moderation and peaceful coexistence, who want to strengthen the circle of the Abraham Accords. And lastly, Daniel, a very difficult subject, but one that can't be avoided. The image of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people marching through the streets of London, Berlin, Paris, and many American cities, openly, energetically supporting a genocidal organization, Hamas, listed as a terrorist group by both the United States and the European Union, displaying Hamas flags, Hezbollah flags, even ISIS flags, must raise profound questions in Western countries about what I call the 3 I's: immigration, integration, and identity. These are very serious issues. They're obviously extraordinarily complex issues, but simply pretending they don't exist or will simply go away, or the second generation will solve the problem of the first generation, is short-sighted in the extreme. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David, and you've raised big issues there, important issues, very immediate issues, and we have a lot to discuss in not very long amount of time. But if I could come back to you first of all, Minister, you talked about Greece as potentially a trustworthy interlocutor for the region, and we've heard in other presentations just how big this agenda is and how challenging it is. Where do you think you can, and how do you think you can exercise that role most effectively?
From the very beginning, Daniel, we had a very constructive role in this conflict. we presented ourselves to the EU GCC summit in Oman, and we had a very balanced position based on principles, not a contractual, not a circumstantial diplomacy. And we think we have developed a very credible attitude towards both the Arabic world and Israel. Then we traveled to Egypt, as David mentioned, with my Prime Minister, and to Israel, in order exactly to express our principled policy, our views about how we should proceed. The truth is that we need to establish, I think, an ecumenical awareness concerning the Middle East. It's very important to bring together both the Arabic countries and the Western countries. I think there is a landing zone concerning the conflict in the Middle East, and I am firmly of the position that we need to discuss, we need to be deliberative. In my eyes, the most distracting things in contemporary times is the fact that we don't hear each other. In my eyes, anti-Semitism is as bad as anti-Muslim or anti-Palestinian. I think we have to be tolerant, contemporary societies need to be tolerant, and we need to discuss. And to be totally honest, I can't see how a reasonable person could just disregard the fundamental principles of ecumenical nature, such as the prevention of civilian losses, the prohibition of hostages, or the need to have very strong and sustainable humanitarian aid. So I think we should go back to the fundamentals. I recognize from the one side that there is a legitimate ground for Israel to self-defend itself, but on the other hand, it is important how Israel does this, and I think it's important to try and prevent at any possible rate the human losses, and especially civilian losses. So yes, Greece is a very credible actor, is a very balanced actor, a very principled actor, and I think we could operate as interlocutors or mediators. It's not our primary target or goal to become interlocutors in this conflict. What we really want is to be principled and useful. And I think we can be useful because we talk on equal terms with all the stakeholders. And I am positive that if we can just sit around the table and discuss, and we did this in Egypt, 6 European countries and the Arabic countries, I think we could come to some sustainable conclusion. So it is by all means to the global benefit that all nations, we try our best in order to mediate, to mitigate human losses, to release hostages immediately, and to bring back peace and prosperity.
I suppose one question is how much Greece can do on its own or separately from its partners in the EU, or would your action be primarily exercised through the EU or in conjunction with EU partners?
Already we have done a lot concerning the European Union. We coordinate with our European partners, and we have reached some important decisions, especially concerning the humanitarian aid and the humanitarian corridor. We have already gathered significant humanitarian aid that we are going to just proceed to Gaza through the European Union and the United Nations. So yes, we do coordinate on an international layer, but on the other hand, we can do also some bilateral efforts with significant stakeholders. I am in constant talk with my Jordanian and Lebanese and Palestinian counterparts in order to discuss how we could be of help in mediating with the current situation. So we are trying to do to provide our goods services both on the level of the European Union and on a bilateral level. There is a possibility that I am traveling also again to the Middle East in order to find the proper space to provide some good services. I think we should just join efforts, Daniel. It's a very difficult situation. I realize that any moment now the situation could get worse, and there are a lot of things that could deteriorate the situation, but what we need now is moderation and dialogue.
So, Wess Mitchell, if I can turn to you, I think the phrase you used was that we were in the early phases of what could become the world crisis of our time, and much of your remarks, I think, was in effect a kind of wake-up call of the gravity of where we are. Can I put it to you that part of the problem in all this is that the free world that you would see as potentially the solution to this is very unhelpfully divided as we go into this, and it's true, of course, of your own country, the United States. Do you think that America itself has really woken up to the gravity of what the situation is at the moment? Because you see, for example, President Biden's request for funds for Ukraine and for Israel, unable to go anywhere right now because Congress is busy arguing with itself.
Well, I don't think that Washington has fully awakened to the scale of the problem. We're probably, I mean, if you just looked collectively at where Washington is at compared to most European capitals, much more awake, judged in terms of the usual metrics of our military dispositions, our military spending, our mindset strategically. I think there are very real political divisions that you're referring to, and it's a schismatic time in Western politics that's now colliding with extreme geopolitical turbulence. I think it's important to understand in Washington, the real state of play, as I understand it, and what people are arguing about. I don't think it's just theater, and I don't think it's trivial in nature. With all due respect to some of the previous panelists, there are important issues. So let me take one example: the border. The border is not secure, and it is imposing real costs on the United States that the border is not secure. The Customs and Border Patrol released data for this year that shows we've had record 250 million people come across the border. 25 million people come across the border since the start of this year, more than any other previous year to date. So I think that's one. Secondly, the size of government spending overall, the debt load that we have a $30 trillion public debt. Higher interest rates will cause further problems with sustaining that. I looked recently at the amount of money we spend on servicing the debt. It's $400 billion a year right now, and that's $100 billion more than what the United States spends on agriculture, all education, secondary and collegiate, science, space, environmental protection. So the point is, I think in Congress, there's a real debate about real issues that's produced the dysfunction. I'm optimistic that the United States will continue to be strongly engaged in the world. I don't think it's just a question of willpower. I think our interests in the world are the best guide to predictive guide for how we behave in the future. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's not about willpower. It's resource trade-offs. It's material in nature. And I don't think those trade-offs are going to go away. I think they're going to present both parties with uncomfortable dilemmas. So you mentioned President Biden's supplemental. President Biden has also not been willing to make important changes on his side of the aisle. For example, Mr. Harris described U.S. policy towards Iran right now, I think is fueling the problem. So I think it'll require both sides of the aisle to do what the foreign minister talked about in his opening remarks, which is compromise. But I think we're far off from that right now.
But I take your point about the very real divisions within America. I think the division that I am most concerned about in this context is the division between those in America who want to see genuinely America engaged in the world right now, and who share your view that you express that alliances are more important than ever, and those who actually see some of the conflicts now as distant conflicts with which America should not be concerned, should not be getting involved in, and should not be sending any more money towards. And that seems to be, viewed from outside anyway, a concerning divide right now.
Well, there is a fatigue. I think the fatigue came out of the wars of the 2000s, Afghanistan, Iraq. But I would also say, over the long term, I think our interests abroad are the best predictive guide to how we behave in the world. And the fact is that the United States is not, historically, we have not in recent times been an insularist or isolationist country. If you look at the structure of our commerce, if you look at the structure of our alliances. And so I think the United States has an interest in staying engaged in Asia and Europe, but that to do that, we have to confront resource trade-offs at home. And I think it's increasingly also resource trade-offs between regions. I mean, I was reading about how we now face a real tension between 155 millimeter howitzer shells that were bound for Ukraine, and they're now bound for Israel. So I think there's a big portion of this that is about the material ability to do the things that our interests would indicate.
Just a very quick aside, you mentioned the Defense Production Act. Do you expect that to be triggered?
Well, I don't know politically. It's hard for me to see how the defense industrial base evolves without doing, how we are nimble enough to keep up with events without doing that. The supply of 155 millimeter howitzer shells is a good example, because right now, the statistics I've seen, we're producing 28,000 a month. Pentagon plans to be producing 100,000 a month by 2027. If you go back to the 1990s, we were producing 900,000 a month. So how we shift into overdrive if we're now facing a 2 or 3 front conflict, I'm not a defense expert, but the defense experts I talk to suggest to me that the defense industrial base is so upside down, we'll have to take fairly draconian steps to get it where it needs to be in real time.
Okay, David, if I could come to you, still on the question actually of divisions, because you said, and it's manifestly true, that Israel has come together in the face of the threat and the atrocity that is perpetrated against it. But is it not also the case that the divisions within Israel were in part responsible for Israel taking its eye off the ball and for leaving Israel vulnerable to what happened? And how concerned are you, if that's the case, that these divisions are potentially weakening, not just perhaps in Israel itself, but more broadly in democracies which face this sort of polarization?
Daniel, I'm not in a position to say whether the divisions prompted Israel to take its eye off the ball, as you suggested. I will speculate, though, that in Iran and in Hamas and Hezbollah, the perception of Israeli weakness and division and distraction may well have contributed to their own planning. Again, it's going to take months for all of this to become better known. It's the nature of democracy, including Israeli democracy, that at the right time it will be better known. But I want to come back for a moment to the foreign minister's comments, if I may, and very much appreciate his emphasis on words like ecumenism, moderation, dialogue, and compromise. And obviously these are some of the important tools of diplomats around the world. But I want to be sure this audience fully understands the degree of horror that unites all Israelis in the face of what happened on October 7th and since, and the revelations that have been coming out about the very specific acts of bestiality, brutality, I would say attempted genocide. And for those of us, and here again, forgive me for speaking personally, but it's too difficult emotionally to detach myself and become an analyst. As the child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust myself, both my mother and my father, what Jews around the world and what Israelis saw was modern-day Nazis seeking the genocide of everyone in their path when they entered Israel. The murder and beheading of babies, the kidnapping of children, the removal of fetuses, the decapitation of fetuses. I mean, forgive me for upsetting the audience perhaps, but this is what Israel is grappling with right now. The ferocity of what happened. It's not just the surprise. It's not just another war for those who want to invoke that awful term, cycle of violence, Daniel. This is something materially different. And this is seen as having been orchestrated with Iran, which openly and repeatedly calls for the eradication of Israel, or as they call it, the Zionist regime. The children and grandchildren of the survivors of the Holocaust, of expulsion from the Arab world, take these threats very literally. And well-intentioned people around the world who want to help must fully understand that this is something quite different. We can't just look for the 50-yard line, the midpoint here, and say, well, how do we bring the parties together? From Israel's perspective, Hamas must be completely eradicated, if that's possible. The difficulties are many. The 200 kidnapped victims, the fact that Hamas cynically uses civilians, the fact that Egypt has largely closed its border. There are lots and lots of challenges here. But if some European nations or others start to become weak-kneed, then I think Israel is going to move in a very different direction because its conclusions are different. Iran means what it says. Hamas means what it says. We just saw a taste of it. Hezbollah means what it says. They're all part of a similar network. Iran even mobilized the Houthis in Yemen to fire missiles in this direction. Syria is a question mark. Israel needs maximum support. Thankfully, until now, it's received it from most of the Western countries. But this is a much larger issue and a longer-term issue. And I think Western nations must understand this was a turning point. This was echoes of the Holocaust. This is not just about a litany of anti-Arabism or anti-Islam or anti-Palestinianism. These are echoes of the Holocaust. And there are few nations on earth, more than Greece, that understand what the Holocaust resulted in. This is how Jews around the world and Israelis see it, nothing less. And I think only those countries that talk to Israel in that language are going to have a chance for a good hearing. Thankfully, Greece is among those countries close to Israel today. But this is what's needed, Daniel. This was a turning point. This was far more than September 11th, even for the United States. And I say that as someone who was just a short hop, skip, and a jump from the World Trade Center and saw the horrors of it and lost people in 9/11. Numerically, proportionally, this was far, far worse by a multiple of 10 or 12. This was Israel's 9/11 on steroids, echoes of the Holocaust, attempted genocide. Things will never be the same again, Daniel, not for a long time.
Yeah. Well, we've heard it, turning point, inflection point. I think that's very, very clear. We're almost out of time, but I want to just take that for one subject that I would like to make sure we didn't miss, which is Greece and Turkey and Greece's relations with Turkey. If this is an inflection point, what does the inflection point mean for Greece's relations with Turkey, which had been improving quite encouragingly?
We live in the same neighborhood, Daniel, and we're obliged by geography to try and live together in peace and prosperity. It is our firm conviction that we need to develop good neighborly relationship. We need to develop friendly relations based on mutual respect. There are things that we could work together. There are some positive measures that we have to develop in many respects. For example, economy or civil protection or joint efforts to mitigate the regular migration. There are issues that are standing there for decades, such as the delimitation of our continental self and exclusive economic zone. However, what we're trying to do now is to try and find a proper mode of dialogue. What I aspire is that we can discuss in a way that not any dispute becomes a crisis. And I think it's very important that the last few months we do have calm and tranquility in our region and in the Aegean Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we need to build up on this momentum. I know it's not an easy situation, but I think it is indeed a window of opportunity for both countries to discuss in good faith, because we have two new governments with fresh mandates. We have two leaders who are genuinely willing to develop good, friendly relationship, and I think we're going to find any opportunity to actually build up a proper relationship. Obviously, there are going to be a lot of problems. You cannot just bring yourself to a position that is absolutely on the opposite direction from what we have encountered in the last few years yet. I think there is a mutual positive willingness to work on this step by step, and we're relatively optimistic that we can find a proper way to proceed.
Thank you. I think we must end it there in the interests of time, but thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, David, for joining us remotely, and thank you very much, Wes. Thank you.